Hey there, my name is Renato Filinic and I'm a UX researcher here at YouTube Zurich. Today I had the pleasure to have a conversation with Christian Gonzalez, Senior Lead UX Researcher on the Creator UX team at YouTube. In our chat, Christian shared his reflections about his UX journey from his beginnings in academia to his current role leading a UX research team at YouTube. With that said, I'll leave you to it. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to the new edition of Interview Relay. It is my pleasure to have today with us Christian, who is a Senior Lead UX Researcher at YouTube. My name is Renato. I'm a UX researcher at YouTube as well, and I'll just leave it to Christian to introduce himself.
Thanks, Renato. Happy to be here. And yeah, I'm a user research manager here at YouTube. I've been here for about 5 years working at YouTube. I lead about a 10-person team of researchers and mainly working with YouTube creators, developing product for YouTube creators, so the tools that creators are using to check their analytics, to upload content, all of that. That's what we build here, and my team kind of helps develop that alongside the engineers and the product managers and designers.
That's great. Sounds like a big scope. So why don't we start from the beginning? Maybe you can tell me a bit more about how you actually got into UX research.
My original, I guess taking it all the way back to when I was in college, my original major was actually English. Thought I was going to be a creative writer, share my poems with the world, but after some hard feedback, I thought maybe it was time to explore some other options, and I started taking some psychology classes. It seemed really interesting. I was learning a lot, and I knew that I didn't want to do any math, so psychology seemed like a safe way to avoid that, for at least for a time. And I learned a lot there, and I think the big thing that really kind of got me into it is I realized I wanted to go to grad school if I wanted to graduate and do anything with my psychology degree, and I ended up working in a research lab. This was at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. That's where I was going to undergrad. And this just happened to be a human factors lab, which I didn't know anything about that. I was just a psych student, just taking general classes. But human factors psychology, that's a much more applied kind of field within psychology. It's really looking at what we understand about human cognition, memory, attention, perception. How can we apply that to people's interactions with technology, with machinery, to make it safe, to make it easy to use, make it fun. And it sort of predates, I think, user experience per se, but it has a lot of the same principles. And in this lab, I was, just kind of a research assistant, but I was working specifically on some projects for the Transportation Safety Administration. This was not that long after 9/11. There was lots of funding around, and we were actually developing materials to train baggage screeners to be able to better identify dangerous items in people's bags. So my job as a research assistant was very, very low on the chain. I would take photoshopped X-rayed images of all sorts of objects like cell phones and laptops, but also guns and other dangerous items that they wanted to select, and rotate them 45 degrees and then save that to a file. But it got me sort of thinking and learning a bit more about how was this training going to be used, what were the hypotheses that we had, and even that small little task became really interesting because I was thinking a bit more of how is this going to take what we know about psychology, and in this case it was a visual perception training, being exposed to different items and being able to detect them, being able to actually make things a bit safer. And so that was kind of what got the bug in my head to do a bit more research myself, and I eventually got into a grad program at George Mason, where it was specifically a human factors program. And there I did some of my own research, working some stuff within automotive safety, so designing auditory displays, so in-vehicle warning systems. If you're driving a self-driving car, back then that was even further out in the future. But we had all these different information that needed to be displayed to the driver. Didn't want that to be visual. That would be really distracting. So we designed some auditory displays and using what we know about how people hear and perceive sound to better distinguish between like, oh, this is a, an urgent warning. This is like, what direction is this coming from? And that was kind of like some of the safety human factors work that we did. While I was in grad school, I also did some internships, and that's really kind of where I started branching out more into industry. I started working at a consulting firm, Fours Marsh Group, outside of DC. There's lots of government contract usability work that's happening in DC. I think it's quite different from what's happening like on the West Coast in tech, but there's a lot of overlap from a research perspective in terms of the methods. And so we would get government contracts to do user research on all sorts of different government projects. Some of it was like data visualization for Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That was also pretty new at the time to help people make better financial decisions. We also did some eye tracking on like IRS tax forms to try to understand how they're easy to use or people kind of like miss information, fill them out properly. So that was kind of my exposure to doing more industry-like user research, and I thought it was really cool because I was using my my training as a scientist and what I've learned as a psychologist and bits and pieces of cognitive psychology, but applying it to a very real world thing. Like we were giving advice, and the government would take that and either make changes to their websites or maybe make some changes to the tax forms. It was a bit disconnected. It was still consulting work, but it was, I think, very rewarding to see that there's like a very direct like societal or user-facing impact to the work I was doing, different from what I had in sort of academia.
So this is very interesting. You have such a varied background. Especially strikes me your very strong academic background. And something that you touched on earlier is you talked about how you were able to apply when you were doing maybe like early in your career contracts with the government, that you were able to apply cognitive ergonomics basically and things that you learned in psychology to real problems, like real world problems. And I was wondering, is this, can you have some of that? Do you put some of that in your work now as a UX researcher or in your past few years at Google? Because you mentioned that it is a very different, it is a very different context. Like we're talking about product instead of, maybe a government initiative. Do you actually apply your psychology background in your job?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's like some of the core content, like the theory, what we know about human cognition that is really relevant. I mean, I spent a lot of time studying working memory, and that is kind of like, the way that's sort of described is like that's your sort of mental workspace, and there's also, it's like resource constrained where there's only so many things you can kind of keep in this like, space where you're able to consciously process, make decisions around that. And I feel like that's a very generalized phenomenon, but it's super relevant to most digital product design where we're asking users to like complete multiple steps and flows, find different types of information. And I think that's always something that, when we're evaluating a new product or a new design, I kind of take it from that lens, like how does this match with what we know about memory limitations? And sometimes, our expectations of our users go beyond what is actually humanly possible from a memory standpoint and attention standpoint. But there's ways that we can break tasks into smaller pieces, use additional memory aids where you can kind of like save and store information so you don't have to retain it in short-term memory or working memory. So that's just like one example, I think, of a really generalized phenomenon. But I feel like the most important parts of my training were really more about thinking like a scientist or thinking like a social scientist in particular, where we want to really understand a behavior or a perception, and we want to break that down into a testable hypothesis. And I feel like that has been like the most useful aspect of my training, is being able to take a really complicated problem, like for music, like how do people how do people decide to listen to music, or how do they choose what music fits their mood? That's like a really high level product problem. That's kind of what YouTube wants to solve. But then, as a researcher, in order to answer that question, we kind of need to turn it into a workable hypothesis, and one that, can be wrong, that can be supported with data or not supported with data, and able to draw conclusions. So I think the psych background definitely helped with that sort of approach to problem solving, and I feel like I use that on a regular basis.
And were you actually able to stay away from mathematics?
No, unfortunately. Well, fortunately, I think I figured out a way to deal with math. Statistics felt very different. And I think statistics is a really important part of research, and in psychology, that is how we express confidence in our hypotheses or our theories. You need statistics is a really important part of that. And I think for me, while I didn't really like math, I did like philosophy, and I did like arguing, and it felt like statistics is a way to have a philosophical argument, and then the numbers are kind of in the background. And I think once I understood that, it really kind of clicked in my head, like why this was useful. And that has been something that is also was part of my graduate training, but I also use on a regular basis at Google. I mean, Google in particular, YouTube is a very data-driven company, so I think working with engineers, product managers, like they kind of speak that language as well. So I think it is, it's a valuable way to share what you've learned with the team, even if they don't have a deep level of expertise. I think there's the value of kind of testing a hypothesis and having some kind of statistical measure of confidence in that is still very useful. So yeah, I couldn't avoid math forever, but I found a way to make it work for me.
I wanted to touch a bit more into this difference between maybe the academia side of your career and the industry experience that you have. What do you think are some of the core differences here?
Yeah, this is definitely something that's really relevant to a lot of like new grads that are maybe coming out of a PhD or a master's program, coming into industry for the first time. Like, while there are differences, like I use my psych background, I use statistics, I kind of use that like scientific thinking on a regular basis. There are a lot of other things that are quite different, and I think one of the biggest ones is obviously like the speed at which we need to generate insights. Like, I might spend, as a grad student, you might spend 6 months, a year, as long as it takes to answer a question, if it's important, and you answer it to a very, very high level of certainty. And I think in an industry environment, you have to get comfortable with doing things much faster, but also with a much lower level of certainty, and being able to make the judgment of like, how much do I apply rigor and get deeper into a topic to answer a question, and being able to judge like what is needed to be able to help a team make a decision. And that's, I think, a different thing as an academic. You're generating new knowledge that is meant to be sort of used by the broader academic community as well as applied in other spaces. It's much more general and broad, whereas in industry, you often have like a smaller team or a very specific focus, very specific type of product question you're trying to answer. So I think being able to focus and make those decisions as to how specific, how much detail you need to get to answer that question is like a different framing. You're using the same skills, but you're making a judgment call about like how to answer a question. Because it's really relevant to helping make a decision.
And I guess I have my answer since you're here, but which one do you prefer?
There's times where I miss academia. I think there is like a particular itch that's hard to scratch in industry of like just really diving into a problem and like knowing something to a very high level. But I feel like, industry is very rewarding because you get that close relationship with your users, and you get very real feedback about whether your ideas, hypotheses, or theories like actually work. Like as an academic, it may be really difficult or impossible to get like super strong real world data that's like, hey, these two variables are related, or like training this type of individual difference might lead to positive results, that you're like very, very far removed. Whereas I think in industry, you'll know, like if your research and the data you've collected suggests, we make product decision one way and it doesn't really pan out, like you'll get that feedback. And I think that that's enjoyable, like to have, be able to really test your ideas. But then also, like I think the other big difference is, having, especially for qualitative research, really getting to know your users, much more deeply, and really considering, their needs, and knowing a particular user group super well. Like for us, it's, for me, it's YouTube creators, which I think are, such a fascinating group of people to just learn about and to try to build product for. They're super inspiring. They're super motivated, and I think that energy sort of makes the research. It kind of like gives you, at least me, it gives me motivation to like keep doing my job. And in academia, since you're far removed, you may not get that like feedback loop, or you get that in a different way. But I think in industry, that close connection to your users really helps you be motivated, and really, in many cases, you're not only representing your own research, but you're also advocating for users and their needs. And that can feel really rewarding if you're, trying to make sure that the product team or the company doesn't make a decision that is harmful to your users. Like that is rewarding, right? Like it makes you feel good about what you're doing, that you're making a difference. And I think maybe this is getting more specific into YouTube than industry in general, but I do feel like that is one of the things that keeps me, working in industry, working at YouTube, and not going back into the academic world. But I do have some academic contacts, doing some work with different grad students and programs. So it's good to keep like one foot in that space, but I think industry is really like what is super motivating to me.
Thanks. And I wanted to explore something different here. You are a manager in your current role, but you haven't started as a manager at Google, and definitely not in your career as a UX researcher. How do you feel your role has changed like throughout the years? And I'm guessing there's a big difference, but I want to understand it more from you.
Yeah, I started at Google as an individual contributor, or an IC. I think this exists in a lot of different roles, and that meant that I was mainly, I was working closely with designers and product managers and engineers, and it's kind of like, at least at Google, you're really embedded on that team. Sometimes you're the only researcher that's working there, but the idea is that you are, one, doing the research yourself, so often like actually talking to participants, collecting data through surveys, other means, analyzing that, reporting that to the team. But it's like very much about the relationship between you and your cross-functional peers, because as a researcher, you don't necessarily make something. You're not putting pixels on the screen. You're not writing code. You have to kind of, you have impact through influence of others. And I think as an individual contributor, where I started, it's really about understanding, your users, understanding the data, but also kind of like your immediate team, and like, what are the real questions that they have? How do I, kind of push for what's right for users, given the fact that like these are the people I'm trying to influence. And I think as my career has grown and now I'm managing researchers, I'm not doing so much like data collection on my own, or doing lots of heavy analysis, but I'm overseeing a lot of stuff. So I think one, it's valuable. My experience, I think, is helpful to understand my team's work and give them feedback, give them support and help if they're junior, sort of learning new skills. But I'm also, have lots of new aspects of my job that go beyond like me working with a team and collecting data to influence like one set of decisions. Like there's like this notion of like being aware of what's happening in the org or in the company, and using that to kind of more softly influence, your team, or kind of like more senior leadership for kind of what is the direction that teams are going towards. So I think, being able to connect the dots between like, this is a body of research that's happening in this part of YouTube in this case, or part of our teams, and there's some other related research here, like actually you two should be talking, or there's actually like a bigger research project here, so we should try to connect these things. So I think that's a new part of my role. Like I think as an individual contributor, you're meant to be really focused in your area and be an expert. And I think as a manager, a big part of your role is kind of looking across all these different, these researchers, kind of working closely in their own spaces, trying to find those meaningful connections, encourage collaboration, and then, communicating with senior leadership. Like here's like a theme amongst like research that's happening and how you should be thinking about that, sort of guiding that while I'm being informed by all of the work that my team is doing and others are doing. So I think there's also this like level of influence that's different. Like it's a broader scope of influence, and then you also are looking over, in my case maybe all of YouTube or parts of Google as well. So I think you have to become more comfortable like not being an expert in every individual area, but looking for like what are the pieces that are maybe relevant or that are connectable across these different spaces, and having a good sort of like sensitivity to that. And also I think some good like soft people skills, because it's hard to, connect people that are in different orgs and try to get them to, go in the same direction, to agree that, things are related and that they should work together. So yeah, I think, these are all kind of like newer skills that I've developed in the past few years as a manager, but I still feel like my core kind of curiosity as a researcher is still there, even if I'm not collecting the data myself and talking to users. It's just, I think, thinking about it on like a broader scale, maybe a longer time scale, and just like this bigger impact. But like it does feel like a growth from where I was at.
So it sounds to me like you're less in the weeds with the actual work. You're less of a domain expert, so to speak, but you have this. Your higher altitude allows you to connect the dots and bring this higher perspective to the.
I think so. Yeah, I'd like to. I kind of like to think of my role as like, the person that's read everything on a particular topic. Like for me, it's YouTube creators, where like I read all of the reports and research that my team produces, but also across YouTube, I'm also trying to keep up on like, what's happening in the industry, and like bringing all of that in to synthesize that to, give guidance to like more senior leadership on like, this is the creator landscape, but then also to my own team of like, hey, maybe you're not aware, there's like, TikTok is doing this new thing and like that's kind of relevant to what you're doing, like maybe we should think about that, we talk about that. And so I think that it's less like deep knowledge on any one area, but there's like a broad, like a breadth of knowledge around a big topic.
And I have a final question for you, Christian. Where do you see UXR evolving in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I think it's been a really interesting evolution. Even just at Google, most of my career has been at Google, that has like moved from, I would say, really design focused like usability testing, which is still super valuable and draws a lot on what we know about cognition, perception, attention. I think that's where research really was focused, is helping to make designs easy to use, easy to understand. And I think from there it's sort of grown to like, well, what is the design trying to accomplish, and like what user needs is this design or this product trying to meet? And I think the questions get a little bit bigger. You get a little bit like farther up the product development life cycle, and I think research has kind of evolved in that direction up until now, where I feel like a big part of user research is really spent on strategy and trying to influence, doing research in areas that are totally new. Like YouTube, we are thinking about short form video. That's like a new area, and the user research team is really focused on understanding like how do creators think about this, how do viewers think about this, how can YouTube change its platform to accommodate for this new form of storytelling, this new this new way of consuming media. I think that's an example of like really kind of top of the product development funnel thinking, where there may be no product or no design. It's really just understanding the landscape and understanding users' needs in that space. So I feel like that trend is going to continue, and maybe a material way that changes is that there are other functions within a company typically that produce insights. Like there's marketing team, they're also thinking about what's happening in the broader marketplace, what users are looking for, the attitudes there. We have a data science team looking at user behavior and how that impacts like our business and how that changes over time. We have business strategy teams. There's lots of different, I think, insight generating functions that, as we all, especially as research kind of like climbs more up to the top of the funnel, like there's other, sort of other areas that I think are there. And so there may be a future where like user research has a clear like strategy kind of track to it, or UX strategy that is, directly in line with business strategy or with marketing or something like that. And maybe these things start to come together as like a broader sort of like insights function. Don't know what that would be, if you're like an insights researcher or not, but it does feel like things are kind of moving in that direction, where we want to use user data. I mean, I think, still grounded in like what UX research really does, like understanding users, understanding their needs, as well as, the human properties that they have around their memory, their perception, to make good product decisions, to make good decisions for users. So I think that UX research will probably continue in that realm, maybe merge even in some companies. This is already happening, where you have like data science and UX research actually rolled together. Maybe this is something that becomes more common practice, where we start merging these different functions into like an insights organization, and then UX research kind of represents our area of depth and knowledge. A lot of that comes from social psychology or social sciences, like anthropology, ethnography, as well as all kind of part of that. But I could see that becoming a role of user research, kind of influencing at a very high level what a company or a team is really going to be doing.
Thank you so much, Christian, for giving us a glimpse into your experience. It's been a pleasure chatting with you today.
Likewise. Thank you, Renato.